Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 25. We're back at Baker Street to drop in on Holmes and Watson for one of their more peculiar cases. It's The Adventure of the Creeping Man from March 1923. And here's Paul with the introduction.
Sherlock Holmes is in a laconic mood and has summoned Dr. Watson peremptorily. Come at once, if convenient. If inconvenient, come all the same. He needs Watson's help in the strange case of Professor Presbury, the eminent Camford physiologist. Events surrounding him have so worried his secretary and prospective son-in-law, Trevor Bennett, that he has sought Holmes's advice. Presbury's faithful dog, Roy, has recently conceived a violent antipathy towards his master, who prowls at night. And then there are the mysterious packages from Mr. Dorak of the Commercial Road, which Bennett is forbidden to open. Somehow it all seems to be connected to the aging professor's engagement to the young daughter of his colleague, Professor Morphy.
The Adventure of the Creeping Man is one of the casebook of Sherlock Holmes, the final collection of short stories, which included 12 tales written between 1921 and 1927. And as with every collection post the memoirs, these stories were not produced to a timetable and appeared when Conan Doyle had the inspiration and the desire to write them. So the question has often been, well, what prompted him to write the casebook in the first place? And there seem to be two big reasons that people will often focus on. The first is that by this time Conan Doyle was very much a leading proponent in spiritualism, and he needed money to fund his spiritualist cause. And in fact, if you think that The Creeping Man was probably written in autumn 1922, he'd spent the summer of 1922 on a lecture tour in America on spiritualist matters, where he'd had one of his early spats with Houdini. And it was around this time that he was really sort of wrapping up his literary part of his life, it feels. He'd started to sell off some of his manuscripts, and he was working with the publisher John Murray to collect his earlier tales into a series of volumes titled things like Tales of Twilight and the Unseen and Tales of Terror and Mystery. But the other reason that's often cited for him writing the casebook is that Sherlock Holmes was experiencing something of a revival at this time, and that was on the back of a series of short films made by the Stoll Picture Company, starring Eileen Norwood as Sherlock Holmes. And Conan Doyle was very taken with the films. He was also very taken with Norwood's performance, and some believe that it was Norwood's ability with disguises that inspired Conan Doyle to write the Sherlock Holmes play The Crown Diamond, which he subsequently adapted as The Adventure of the Mazarin Stone, which became the first of the casebook. And in fact, it was the month before the Mazarin Stone came out that Conan Doyle attended the Stoll Picture Company dinner and gave a speech that was very full of praise about the series and indeed Eileen Norwood himself. Of course, as soon as Greenhouse Smith received The Adventure of the Mazarin Stone, he was straight on to Conan Doyle and asking for more short stories, but Conan Doyle was really clear that he could only write if he had good ideas, and he felt that he'd exhausted his own stock, as he put it. And in fact, he did suggest that the Strand run a competition for ideas, but this was rejected as being impractical. So it really was a case of waiting for inspiration to strike, and we'll come on to what that specific inspiration may well have been in a little while. So The Adventure of the Creeping Man was then published in March 1923 in the UK in the Strand magazine, and the same month in Hearst International in America, with 6 illustrations by Frederick Dorr Steele, which are fantastic illustrations and really capture that sort of dark Gothic mood of the short story. And there's the tantalizing suggestion that the adventure of the Creeping Man may have been yet another attempt at a last Sherlock Holmes story. He'd already tried with The Final Problem and The Second Stain and His Last Bow. But a few months after The Creeping Man was published, he was doing another American lecture tour on spiritualism, and there he gave the strong signal that he'd written his last Sherlock Holmes story. And as Douglas Kerr has pointed out, this is very significant when we come to think about some of the things that Sherlock Holmes says at the end of the story in one of his more philosophical moods. And I mentioned that this has a very Gothic feel to it, very reminiscent of some of Conan Doyle's early stories, but it's also often cited as a science fiction story, and there was quite a lot of that fusion of science fiction and horror at this time.
Yeah, it's difficult to work out what the story actually is, really, because the explanation for the professor's behaviour, which we'll come on to later, is essentially pseudoscientific. But the story itself is structured. Essentially, it's a werewolf story. It's very traditional, very Gothic in its structure and in the tropes that it employs. Creeping shadows in the night, that kind of thing, and the mystery behind what's going on, usually at night, in this big old house. So you do have this very traditional Gothic structure within which Conan Doyle places a semi-science fiction sort of story. In many ways, it's interesting to think whether Conan Doyle intended this as a Sherlock Holmes story at all, or even if this was one of the ideas that's been drifting about in the back of his head and might have been a story idea he's had for a while, because it feels very reminiscent in many ways of stories of the 1890s, or 1880s, 1890s, where there was a lot of these science fiction, horror, occult mashups going on. I'm thinking, of course, of things like Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau, F. Marion Crawford's The Witch of Prague. All these sorts of stories were very much in the air. So it actually can't be nailed down. And of course, is it really a detective story? At points, it feels as if Holmes has been pushed into a different story.
Yeah. And if we think about this as a science fiction story, it does that thing of taking a scientific topic that was that had a lot of currency and then expanding on it in some ways. And the whole story draws on rejuvenation therapies and the idea that transplantation of animal tissue to humans would help people overcome old age and senility. And a lot of it had its origins with the early work on hormones in the second half of the 19th century by scientists like Brown-Séquard in France. But there was also a scientist called Serge Voronov, a French surgeon who was originally from Russia, who did many experiments in the 1920s, started by transplanting thyroid glands from chimpanzees to treat humans with thyroid deficiencies. But in the 1920s and 30s, he came to be transplanting monkey glands and to humans for therapeutic purposes. And as much as he himself, Voronov, actually said himself that this wasn't a kind of aphrodisiac, it very much got associated with being a therapy for failing virility. And he wasn't some sort of crank. I mean, by 1923, 700 of the world's leading surgeons had convened at the International Congress of Surgeons in London and were applauding Voronov for his work in the rejuvenation of old men. But in addition to Voronov, there was another person who's important in this story called Eugene Steinach, who was a Viennese physiologist who did a lot of work into estrogen and testosterone. And he too performed transplants. And in fact, Richard Brown, in a very good article on this topic in Canadian Holmes, noted that in Vienna, Steinach's assistant was called Dr. Robert Leichenstein, from which we might well get Lowenstein of Prague in this story. And one of Steinach's patients was actually W.B. Yeats, who had apparently a second puberty in April 1934 after he'd been Steinached. But others were less fortunate. There's a case in the newspapers in 1921 of a chap called Mr. Alfred Wilson, a 72-year-old who had apparently regained his youth after being Steinached in Vienna for the sum of £700, which was equivalent to about £40,000 today. And apparently, having gone through this miraculous treatment, his hair had begun to grow back on his head. He was contemplating marriage to his young nurse, I bet he was. There's photographs of him in the newspapers sort of doing stretches and sawing pieces of wood in half. And as if that's the sign of virility. And then he was so convinced that the treatment was successful that he decided to hire an enormous lecture venue to give a talk on this miracle cure. And what perfect lecture venue could there be for somebody who's had monkey testicle transplants but the Albert Hall? And so he booked the Albert Hall for this lecture, but unfortunately the day before his housekeeper found him dead. And so when everybody turned up at the Albert Hall, they were greeted by a notice on the door that said, "In consequence of the sudden death of Mr. Alfred Wilson, the lecture will not take place." But it's amazing, this all of this stuff, really current at the time. In fact, there were two news stories in October 1922, which would be right at the time that Conan Doyle was starting to put pen to paper on The Creeping Man, that are very relevant. The first was that Voronov was actually lecturing in London in October 1922. The second is that there was a story that came out of the Paris newspapers and was widely circulated, including in the British newspapers, about a plan for a vast breeding farm of monkeys in West Africa, of all places, where, of course, Conan Doyle had visited in his youth. So, a couple of reasons why these stories might well have piqued his interest. And if you look at the popular response to people like Voronov, there's a mixture of both acclaim and ridicule, and it seeps into the popular culture. So, in 1920s, Harry's Bar in Paris launched a new cocktail called the Monkey Gland, which contained gin, orange juice, grenadine, and absinthe, which is either going to cure your virility or kill it for good. There's then a musical comedy called The Elixir based on this theory. There was one of those great 1920s movie serials called The Screaming Shadow, which ran for 15 episodes, and the promotion described it as a story that is novel and up-to-date in its conception, being founded on the monkey gland theory and the possibility of eternal youth. And then, Conan Doyle's not the only author who's drawing on this as well. There's actually a wonderful novel by Dorothy L. Sayers, herself a Sherlockian, who wrote the wonderful Lord Peter Wimsey novel, The Unpleasantness at the Bologna Club, which... skip 30 seconds if you don't want to know what happens. The murderer is Dr. Penberthy, who actually kills for money so that he can fund his new clinic, which is going to make everybody good by glands. And they say that, so very wonderful. This is one character says of Dr. Penberthy, so very wonderful about glands, isn't it? Dr. Voronov, and all those marvellous old sheep. Such a hope for us all.
Yes, it's interesting that you should mention there this musical, The Elixir, because basically what is happening with this monkey gland idea moving into literature, it is, again, just an updating of an old idea. I mean, this goes back to antiquity and the idea of the elixir of youth. And again, it was a strong theme in a lot of writings of the fin de siècle. A lot of the stories I've already mentioned go into this, like Marion Crawford's The Witch of Prague. The central side of that is around the misuse of hypnotism and a form of elixir, in which the wicked magician Keogh Arabian is attempting to keep an old man alive by distilling the essence of youth from a young victim, Israel Kafka. And his associate, the witch Unona, is using her hypnotism to trick Kafka into believing that he's just getting this gentle sleep. And each time he gets experimented upon, he's losing a month of his life, which is going into the body of the old man. So it's a similar idea, but given this magic twist, or it's another side of it. You could say Dracula.
Yeah.
What is Dracula about? It is about draining youth. It is about prolonging life, prolonging youth. Very pointedly, Dracula starts the novel as a grey-haired, grey-moustached old man, and as he takes blood from his victims, he becomes younger and younger throughout the novel. So it's again a magical, occult version of the same story. But of course, there's also another element in Dracula, which has the up-to-date scientific element, where Van Helsing is using experimental methods of blood transfusion to try and keep the victims alive. And this does seem to work, whereas in reality, of course, there's no mention of blood types and so on, or donor rejection. So all of that idea is ignored in Dracula, and I think I'm right in saying that there is a surgeon who said with the monkey glands that there would have been a lot of cases of rejection there if this was real science.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the really peculiar things about the Creeping Man is that you would kind of expect it to be a story about an old man who's hoodwinked into a false remedy, or in fact it might be the placebo effect, or it's psychosomatic. But actually, it does seem to work. It's just got these horrible side effects. And you have the Bennett says at one point, Presbury has never been in better health. In fact, he is stronger than I have known him for years. And in fact, Holmes writes to Lowenstein of Prague at the end to say, he holds him criminally responsible for what is going on, which you kind of, it might be because he just thinks he's selling sham remedies, but that's not what comes across in this case. This is the odd thing about this sort of almost magical treatment that he's getting is that it does seem to genuinely have some kind of impact.
I think that's the key, where you've just mentioned the word magical there. That's what's actually going on. This is why, really, this story is more of an occult, magical horror story than a science fiction story per se, because this crazy idea does work, as you say, with these rather unfortunate side effects. And of course, in the classic horror story versions like Dracula, yes, it does work because we were in the realms of magic and the occult.
So what you're saying is this is monkey magic?
Essentially, yes. Irrepressible. And speaking of matters magical and occult, there's another pointer in this story to say this is more the direction Conan Doyle was actually thinking, in that the serum itself, the gland serum, originates from Prague, and with this mysterious figure Lowenstein, which the very name connects him essentially with the Jewish ghetto of Prague, the Jewish quarter where the golem was created, in Prague legend. And Prague is the city of alchemists, and it's always got this name of magical Prague, which the Italian writer Ripollino talks about very enthusiastically, and this comes particularly from the late 16th century, early 17th century, in the time of the Emperor Rudolf II, who was absolutely fascinated by the occult, and to the extent that he neglected his imperial duties and so on, and eventually had to be dethroned. But he invited many of the magicians and occultists of Europe into Prague, figures like John Dee and Edward Kelly, and had streets of alchemists. And again, in this sense, it is interesting that alchemy is chosen, because alchemy is often considered merely as this foolish attempt to transmute base metals into gold. But there's far more involved. It involves the transmutation of the alchemist's soul, and is another attempt to get towards the elixir of youth, or the elixir of eternal life. So this all ties together in this theme of the creeping man, and is no doubt why Conan Doyle chose to place the kind of the real villain of the piece in Prague.
And thinking about Professor Presbury as the sort of central figure in this, it's worth thinking a bit about who might have inspired that character. And W.W. Robson, in the Oxford Sherlock Holmes edition of the casebook, made the excellent observation that the character and the circumstances of Professor Presbury may well draw on the life of Professor William Rutherford, who was another professor of physiology at Edinburgh this time, who taught Conan Doyle. And Conan Doyle, of course, cited Rutherford as one of the inspirations for Professor Challenger. He wrote in Memories and Adventures, most vividly of all, there stands out in my memory the squat figure of Professor Rutherford, with his Assyrian beard, his prodigious voice, his enormous chest, and his singular manner. He fascinated and awed us. I have endeavoured to reproduce some of his peculiarities in the fictitious character of Professor Challenger. And if you think about the description of Presbury himself, who's a portly, large-featured man, grave, tall, frock-coated, with the dignity of bearing which a lecturer needs. I mean, this could also be another version of Rutherford. And Robson notes that there are another couple of connections here. One is that Rutherford was actually apprenticed to and eventually took over from Professor John Hughes Bennett at Edinburgh, so that's possibly where we get the name Bennett from. And there was, in fact, a painful public scandal in Rutherford's life, a bit like the one that apparently circulated around the university when Professor Presbury was up to his various antics. And for Rutherford, it came in December 1886. He had an altercation with his senior assistant where he seems to have been out of line and had an argument with Herbert H. Ashdown, during which Ashdown felt that his moral character was being impugned. And Rutherford then repeated these claims to other academics and even to his class. And the issue became a very bitter one. Ashdown resigned because the university was unable to investigate and support him. And eventually it transpired that actually Ashdown's was the third or fourth resignation that had unexpectedly occurred in the same department. So there was a sort of pattern of bullying or unprofessional behaviour from Rutherford. Rutherford actually eventually issued this very forthright and full apology, one that you wouldn't see from politicians today, where he was absolutely unreserved in saying, I really shouldn't have done this, and I'm desperately sorry, and I'm very sad that you resigned. And it clearly played on him because he applied for 6 months' leave, and at the end of that applied for another 6 months as well. And it was quite the topic of conversation in the Edinburgh press throughout the year. And for all this took place in Edinburgh after Conan Doyle had left the university, Robson points out that at the time of writing The Creeping Man, Conan Doyle was in the early stages of pulling together his memoirs, and he was looking back over his university days and his early life in Edinburgh. And it may well have been through that some of these details came to his attention and became part of the framework of The Creeping Man. And the other thing that connects Rutherford, I don't think Robson points this out, but the other thing that connects Rutherford to this story is that Rutherford was a noted vivisectionist and got into a lot of trouble with this. There were some public investigations. And in Memories and Adventures, Conan Doyle recalls, Rutherford was, I fear, a rather ruthless vivisector. And though I have always recognised that a minimum of painless vivisection is necessary and far more justifiable than the eating of meat as a food, which is an interesting point, I'm glad that the law was made more stringent so as to restrain such men as he. Ach, these German frags, he would exclaim in his curious accent as he tore some poor amphibian to pieces. Quite remarkable.
So, yeah, there was quite a level of public distaste at the idea of vivisection and its purpose within scientific investigation. I mean, there are incidents 50 years apart of two different French scientists who came to Britain to actually give public demonstrations in vivisection. The first one in 1824 was the French physiologist François Magendie, and then in 1874 another French physiologist, Eugene Steinach, both of whom were essentially run out of town for their level of over-enthusiasm. And there was also a certain subgenre of literature, anti-vivisection literature. I mean, one of the novels, later novels of Wilkie Collins, Heart and Science, is very strong on this theme with a very villainous vivisectionist, Dr. Benjulia. Really unpleasant piece of work. But the most famous book to look at this whole issue really is H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau, published in 1896, in which Moreau it has an island in the Pacific, which is essentially where the Galapagos Islands are situated, where he is carrying out these rather pointless vivisection experiments, where he's trying to physically turn animals into human beings using surgery. There's absolutely no reason for him to do this other than personal satisfaction. And it's making a point about almost research gone mad, as well as the scientists carrying out the research. And Morrow, when he's trying to explain his reasonings to the book's narrator, says, "You see, I went on with this research just the way it led me. That is the only way I ever heard of research going. I asked a question, devised some method of getting an answer, and got a fresh question. Was this possible, or that possible? You cannot imagine what this means to an investigator, what an intellectual passion grows upon him. You cannot imagine the strange, colourless delight of these intellectual desires." And it's just utter pointlessness of what he's doing. It is the point being made. And in some ways you can compare this to another one of the great proto-science fiction novels of the time, Jekyll and Hyde, where the experiment that Jekyll's carrying on, where he trying to separate the good from the bad, is utterly pointless, because he separates out the good does good, but then the Hyde comes in and smashes up what the good has done. It's utterly pointless, and it is this questioning of science that within a cultural context that's going on here. And there is an element of this in The Creeping Man. Yes, Presbury's doing it for a particular reason, in a sense, because he's become engaged to this young woman, but it is pointless, and it won't last. And again, perhaps Doyle was thinking of another short story which we mentioned in episode 23, the Keimplatz experiment, Dr. Heidegger's experiment by Nathaniel Hawthorne, where a group of foolish old people drink the elixir of youth. They become young for a time, behave foolishly, and then old age creeps up on them again pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think the pointlessness of this is a really important point when we connect this back to the spiritualist aspect as well. If you think about what Holmes says at the end of this story, he says, "There is danger there, a very real danger to humanity. Consider, Watson, that the material, the sensual, the worldly would all prolong their worthless lives. The spiritual would not avoid the call to something higher. It would be the survival of the least fit. What sort of cesspool may not our poor world become?" And in a way, Holmes is less concerned with the treatment and more with the endeavour, this actual desire of these people to try to extend their lives. I mean, he says later, when one tries to rise above nature, one is liable to fall below it. The highest type of man may revert to the animal if he leaves the straight road of destiny. And this is Holmes the spiritual, if not the spiritualist, because what he's talking about is that the natural order of things is that we die, and that the innate desire to cheat death is completely pointless. And it's almost an insult to the spiritualist worldview that somebody should seek to extend their life beyond its natural term. And I think Douglas Kerr picks this up really well in his article, and it was reissued within that same Canadian Holmes issue I mentioned earlier, where he says, this is the closest that we actually get to spiritualism appearing in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And again, the fact that this may have been the final short story that Conan Doyle was intending to write with Sherlock Holmes, it becomes quite an important final moment. It's a piece of philosophizing that seems quite out of character. So seeing it at the end of this story, which could indeed be the final one of the Sherlock Holmes stories, it could be very, very important in that respect. And you've got to remember, this is the closest bit that the veil between the spiritualist work and the Sherlock Holmes story starts to it becomes transparent for a brief moment of time, I think.
Yeah, there's a real specificity about it when you compare it to Holmes's earlier philosophizing in the Naval Treaty on the Rose, or in the Cardboard Box about the struggle of life and what's it all about. This is more specific.
Yeah, much more.
But the thing that strikes me in particular with this whole philosophizing at the end of the Creeping Man is that wonderful subversion of Herbert Spencer's idea of the survival of the fittest.
Oh yes,
it's just almost throwaway in this. It's just brilliantly put in.
Yeah, it's lyrical, isn't it? It's wonderful, that moment, and that whole point. What sort of cesspool may not our world become? Gosh, it's really powerful stuff, actually. I think that's one of the things that we also worth saying, that for all people often criticize this story, or indeed the casebook more generally, there are always things within these stories to enjoy. You gave one of my favorite bits from this, which is of course the famous telegram at the beginning. Actually, I was going to say there's a quite good moment at the end of the Granada adaptation of The Creeping Man, where Holmes is giving that exact same speech, the philosophizing speech at the end, and in front of Lestrade and Watson. And Lestrade turns around and says, "Well, when you quite finished."
Yes, it's interesting talking about all these matters spiritual, because as Holmes points out, this story is anything but spiritual, and the whole vivisection movement and so on was driven by that particular branch of medical science known as physiology. And of course Presbury is a physiologist, as was Rutherford, as are people like Morrow. And of course, the whole reasoning behind this story lies with Professor Presbury's physical desire, his desire to regain, and again we can only presume this, regain a flagging virility, and this is why he's undergoing this monkey gland therapy.
Yeah, and this isn't the first time that Conan Doyle has looked at this sort of idea of this match between the older professor and the younger woman. In fact, even between the older physiologist and the younger woman, because there's a much earlier story called A Physiologist's Wife, which sort of plays on some of the similar kind of concerns that Conan Doyle has, and we've mentioned before in the podcast about materialist science. It comes around time and time again in his writing. So in A Physiologist's Wife, the main character is Professor Ainsley Gray, and he's the ultimate materialist science. He doesn't believe in love. He can only conceive of it as a sort of chemical reaction. Then he meets a beautiful widow and falls head over heels in love, and of course that doesn't work out, and the story ends with him dying of a broken heart. And it's a beautiful piece. It's a wonderful short story. The thing that's interesting about that and The Creeping Man is that you've got a similar kind of theme going on here with this aged physiologist, but in the case of A Physiologist's Wife, it's very much about romantic love, and in The Creeping Man, the undertone is entirely sexual. This is much more about a sort of sexual infatuation with a much younger woman, and in part it's a sort of marking of the passage of time since the early Holmes stories of the 1890s through to The Creeping Man, the post-war era, where as Owen Dudley Edwards has pointed out, there is a much greater focus in the casebook on some of those fundamental human problems, and particularly on sort of transgressive sexual behaviour. I mean, in the casebook we've got the illustrious client with Baron Gruner. We've got in Retired Colourman, you've got the adultery taking place. You've got the events of Thor Bridge. These are stories that deal with sexual desire much more explicitly than you see anywhere else in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And it might be significant in this story that it's not the Morphy family who object to the match between Professor Presbury. It's actually Professor Presbury's family who object to his engagement with Miss Morphy, and this sort of sense in which he might be behaving rather inappropriately, and it might be unsuitable for a man his age.
Yeah, and there might also be a question, perhaps lurking behind this, of Presbury's daughter and Bennett himself as well, being worried by the prospect of Presbury having another child, particularly if it's a son. Bennett seems to have set himself up quite nicely to be the professor's successor, and move into his place, probably both professionally and economically. And the presence of another child would upset plans of that kind quite seriously.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But having said that, their primary concern does seem to be about this inappropriate, strange behaviour, these character changes that the professor's going through, and that there might be the possibility of scandal lurking around the corner, and this is presumably why Bennett has brought in Holmes in the first place, because Holmes is renowned for his discretion and being able to get things done. And perhaps, it's interesting to speculate again about Conan Doyle's thoughts on his own father, and his behaviour, his drunken behaviour, an frequent embarrassment to the family in Edinburgh, which definitely came out in a lot of his earlier stories. I mean, the story we covered in episode 1, the Doings of Raffles Hall, where you've got the old McIntyre character who gradually becomes more and more of a slave to drink, and in the end breaks into Raffles Hall's laboratory, and is seen doing this, and it's described in this way: an electric lamp burned in the laboratory, and the silver squares of the 3 large windows stood out clear and bright in the darkness. The centre one had been thrown open, and even as he gazed, Robert saw a dark, monkey-like figure spring up onto the sill and vanish into the room beyond. And this is in 1891. In the same year, he wrote another short story called A Sordid Affair, which is a little domestic vignette about an artist with a serious drink problem, and is quite clearly based on Conan Doyle's own family experience. And the artist John Raby at one point is found in the street, essentially gibbering on all fours, and is compared again to an ape. So this kind of worry about the behaviour of the family patriarch is an ongoing concern throughout his fiction, and there is, I think, very real reason to believe that this also informs Presbury.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this also plays very much directly into that Victorian fear of the regression. And that's exactly what you see is happening with Presbury, this man who can be a genius in his lectures, but every 9 days he's going to become this rabid lunatic.
And presumably this is exactly why Doyle has chosen the monkey as the kind of alter ego of the professor, rather than as I said earlier, rather than the more traditional werewolf idea, where the wolf is the frighteningly virile creature of folklore. And it's interesting that at one point in the story, Holmes pointedly dismisses cycles of the moon.
Yes, he
as
does.
playing a part in this.
Yeah.
So it's a deliberate move away from the classic werewolf idea, and the easiest way to show how Presbury is moving back into the animal world is by showing him regressing into a more ape-like form. It's interesting in this way to compare it to Rudyard Kipling's 1891 story, The Mark of the Beast, where an Englishman who insults the Hindu monkey god Hanuman by stubbing out his cigar on the forehead of his statue is then cursed by a temple leper to regress to animal form himself. But this is again, it's a wolf, which presumably because the temple god is a monkey, that the monkey is there seen as a higher being than the wolf. So the man regresses into a wolf. But again, the ideas are there.
Yeah, and that's a good point about the phases of the moon as well, because that's an aspect of this story where Conan Doyle sort of has his cake and eat it, in that he's quite prepared to play on the Gothic tropes and then completely undermine them at the same time. So you have the phases of the moon, but it isn't actually the phases of the moon. You've got that moment where Presbury clambers up the wall, which is straight out of Dracula.
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the way Conan Doyle describes Presbury's antics in this way, with his dressing gown flapping on each side of him, he looked like some huge bat glued against the side of his own house, a great square dark patch upon the moonlit wall. And you look at a particular passage from Dracula where the Count climbs down the wall of his castle. I saw the whole man slowly emerge from the window and begin to crawl down the castle wall over that dreadful abyss, face down, with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings. It's very similar.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the problem I find with the Creeping Man in particular, is the fact that we've had Presbury described earlier as a portly figure.
Yes.
So having him creeping about on the ivy outside his house, it doesn't quite wash. And it's notable in the Granada series that they cast Charles Kay, an actor who is considerably smaller than the character is described in the story.
Yeah, and very sprightly if you believe his acting in that tree at the end.
No, absolutely. And the whole idea of regressing back to the monkey state also fits in with ideas which really began to surface after Darwin and the evolutionary theories, but were really informing the culture in the 1890s, again in particular, with the idea of decadence and degeneration. The fact that Western culture was sliding backwards, and that there's a particularly striking book was written at the time by the journalist Max Nordau, simply entitled "Degeneration," where he sees modern art as an aberration, partly because he doesn't understand it, but it just instinctively horrifies him as well. So he around this builds a whole theory about the decadence of Western civilization, and it's going to go the way of the Roman Empire if we're not careful, or even worse. And as I say, these ideas were hugely in vogue in the era of the fin de siècle. But it's interesting that the Creeping Man is written in 1923, at the time when the Nazis were starting their inexorable rise in Germany, and they were tapping into a lot of these ideas about racial degeneration and that artistic degeneration played into all this, and that unless something was done about it, the Western civilization was doomed, and how they perverted all these ideas.
Yeah, and Nordau actually says something about the collapse of science as well, that in Western society science will collapse into magic, and that one of the pieces of evidence of that is the interest in spiritualism as well. And while we're on the topic of degeneration, I think one of the things that's less pleasing about The Creeping Man is that the characters of Holmes and Watson in this story feel to me quite stereotypical. They feel almost like Conan Doyle's not living the characters in the same way he was in the 1890s, when he was writing these at a pace, and he's living with them in his head all the time, and also he's not fed up with them in the 1890s. But by the time you get here, you got quite a different view of Holmes and Watson. I mean, the story starts with this quite meek Watson describing himself as being just one of Holmes' habits, and is as much use as the bedstead. And that he recognises that he irritates Holmes with a certain methodical slowness in my mentality, which, is not new. In Hound of the Baskervilles, Holmes says, it may be that you are not yourself luminous, but you are a conductor of light. It's much the same point, but actually in this, Watson readily accepts such was my humble role in our alliance. He's very kind of passive and simple in this one, and of course his great comic moment is to suggest that Professor Presbury is suffering from lumbago. And then, but in terms of Holmes, you've got Holmes also is this strange kind of withdrawn character, a man of fixed habits. He's even quite smug at one point. He says, the same old Watson, you never learn that the gravest issues may depend upon the smallest things. He's quite patronizing, and, he can be that at the best of times. But in this, it feels like Conan Doyle is so distant from the characters that these are almost caricatures. And it might be, actually, that ties into that whole business of watching the Stoll pictures. That actually... particularly on the case of Watson, Hubert Willis, who played Watson for most of those movies, is almost completely forgettable in the role of Watson. They very much sideline him to just being asking the dumb questions. So there's a sense in which these are not quite the same characters. You also get a sense that they're in a different phase of their life, and that's really telegraphed very early on, where Watson says this is one of the last cases that Holmes had in practice. And there's this quite nice detail that you get in the casebook that at this time Holmes has got other people around him who are working for him. So in this story we're introduced to Mercer, who he says, "Mercer is since your time," said Holmes. "He's my general utility man who looks up routine business." And then in The Illustrious Client you have Shinwell Johnson, who is this sort of rather dodgy character at the lower echelons of society, and then in contrast to him, you've got Langdale Pike, who's at the upper echelons of society. He sits in his St. James Club as the receiving station as well as the transmitter for all the gossip of the metropolis. So, you have this idea that Holmes has sort of withdrawn to his Baker Street premises and has other people doing this detection work for him. And it struck me, thinking about the timing of this story, that Conan Doyle at this point had just taken out a 5-year lease on a property called 15 Buckingham Palace Mansions in Victoria. It's just between Victoria Station and Buckingham Palace itself. And, he had a young family that was at Windlesham, but actually he was working more and more out of London. And it's quite possible that Creeping Man is the first story he wrote in that venue. And there he lived pretty much on his own, except for a housekeeper. And he once wrote to Jean Leckie, his wife, saying, I've burnt the coffee. And it reminded him of his very early days in Southsea. But you get the sense that Holmes at this time might be a bit like Conan Doyle is, that he actually is a guy living pretty much on his own, in his own place in central London, and he has a network of people around him who are doing bits and pieces of work for him.
Oh, it's interesting you talk there as well about a particular aspect of the story being telegraphed. And there are two cases of early telegraphing in The Creeping Man, and the other one is where Watson makes an early mention of the Copper Beeches.
Oh, yes.
And essentially, he's almost by that telling the reader what he's going to be doing at the end. I.e., Presbury is savaged by a dog, and Sherlock Holmes has a doctor on hand to patch him up afterwards.
Yeah.
And again, perhaps that's Conan Doyle making a sly little reference to the fact that these are very formulaic stories. I've done all this before.
Yeah, and it did strike me this time round how much it felt a bit like The Speckled Band to some extent. I mean, in that the end of this story is a stakeout, essentially. You've got them waiting on the outside for the inevitable horror to unfold. And you also have other things like the confrontation with the villainous professor, whether it's Moriarty or it's Leslie Armstrong in The Missing Three-Quarter, or indeed it's Dr. Roylott in The Speckled Band. But it's not quite the same, is it? It doesn't feel quite the same. It feels like it's all self-referential in that sense.
And you've also got this again comes back to the sort of horror gothic element. In one sense, The Speckled Band is a haunted house story, and The Copper Beeches is a werewolf story.
Yeah. Well, I think that's about all the time we have for The Creeping Man. If you want to find the show notes, you can find them at the website, doingsofdoyle.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please give us a rating or review, or consider sponsoring us on Patreon. You can find the links in the show notes. And Paul, what are we looking at next time?
Next time, we're going on an undersea adventure with the Maracot Deep.
The Maracot Deep. Excellent. So we will see you next month. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye. do monkey glands do anything for podcasting?
I doubt it. I don't think they do much for anything, to be quite honest.